After being betrayed and abandoned by her wealthy husband at an upscale club, a woman rediscovers happiness and surprises everyone who laughed at her years later. First, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more exciting stories like this one. The morning sun filtered lazily through the silk curtains of the master bedroom in the Anderson mansion. Elizabeth, a 40-year-old woman with the natural elegance of someone born to shine, slowly opened her eyes, letting the reality of her seemingly perfect life envelop her like a soft blanket. Beside her, Richard was still asleep. Her husband, a successful 45-year-old businessman, seemed to carry the weight of the world in his furrowed brows, even in deep sleep. Elizabeth observed him for a moment, feeling a twinge of concern that she quickly brushed aside. After all, there was no reason for worries in her life full of luxury and comfort, right? She rose with the grace of a ballerina, her bare feet sinking into the Persian rug that covered the marble floor. She walked to the window and opened the curtains with a fluid gesture, allowing light to flood the room. The panoramic view of Beacon Hill, one of Boston's most exclusive neighborhoods, stretched out before her as a constant reminder of her social status. "Another perfect day," she murmured to herself, a rehearsed smile dancing on her perfectly outlined lips. Elizabeth headed to the closet, a room larger than many apartments in the city. Endless rows of designer clothes, shoes, and handbags awaited her. Each piece was a work of art, carefully selected to compose the image of the trophy wife she had become over the years. As she chose her outfit for the day, a Chanel dress and Louboutin shoes, Elizabeth found herself reflecting on her life. 20 years of marriage to Richard had given her everything a woman could materially desire. The mansion in Beacon Hill, the luxury cars in the garage, the jewels that adorned her body like shining constellations, everything screamed success and achievement. However, something was missing. An uncomfortable feeling, almost imperceptible, like a pebble in your shoe that you can't locate but know is there. She shook her head, pushing those thoughts away. There was no room for doubts in her meticulously planned life. Elizabeth finished getting ready, applying her makeup with the precision of a surgeon. The reflection in the mirror showed a stunning woman, without a wrinkle to tell the story of her internal concerns. She descended the marble stairs, the sound of her heels echoing through the empty house. The staff was already in position, moving silently like efficient shadows. Breakfast was served on the veranda, an explosion of colors and aromas that rivaled the impeccable garden around it. Richard joined her minutes later, dressed in a custom-made Italian suit. He kissed her on the cheek, a mechanical gesture that had long lost its warmth. "Good morning, darling," he said, his eyes already fixed on his cell phone. "I have an important meeting today. Don't wait up for dinner." Elizabeth nodded, swallowing her disappointment along with a sip of coffee. "Of course, love. Good luck at the meeting." Richard barely heard, already absorbed in emails and messages. The silence between them was filled only by the clinking of cutlery and the occasional chirping of birds in the garden. After breakfast, Elizabeth watched her husband leave in his silver Porsche, waving distractedly as he exited through the mansion's ornate gates. She stood there for a moment, watching the car disappear around the bend, a feeling of emptiness settling in her chest. The day unfolded like so many others before it. Elizabeth oversaw preparations for a charity lunch that would take place over the weekend, shopped at exclusive boutiques, and had lunch with friends at the country club. Each activity was a carefully choreographed act, performed with the precision of someone who knows their role by heart. It was during lunch at the club that the first crack in her perfect facade began to form. Sitting with Sarah, Emily, and Rachel, the trio of friends who formed her innermost circle, Elizabeth noticed something different in the air. The laughter seemed forced, glances were frequently averted, and there was an underlying tension she couldn't decipher. "So, Elizabeth," Sarah began, nervously fiddling with her pearl necklace, "how are things with Richard? We haven't seen him around here at the club in a while." Elizabeth felt a knot in her stomach, but kept the plastic smile on her face. "Oh, you know how it is. He's been so busy with work, barely has time to breathe, let alone play tennis." Emily and Rachel exchanged quick glances, almost imperceptible, but Elizabeth noticed, and the uncomfortable feeling that had been haunting her since morning intensified. "Well, I hope he's not overworking himself," said Emily, her voice laden with a concern that sounded false to Elizabeth's ears. After all, life's too short to spend all our time working, isn't it? Elizabeth agreed mechanically, her smile now a rigid mask. The lunch continued with superficial conversations about the latest fashion trends and gossip about other club members, but she barely listened. Her mind was filled with questions and suspicions she dared not verbalize. Upon returning home, the mansion seemed even larger and emptier. Elizabeth wandered through the rooms, her steps echoing in the immense spaces. She stopped in front of a wall full of photographs, frozen moments of a life that now seemed to belong to someone else. There she was with Richard on their honeymoon in Paris, young and in love. In another photo, the couple smiled on a yacht in the Hamptons. Gala parties, award ceremonies, exotic trips. Each image was a testament to a life of privilege and success. But where was the happiness in those perfectly framed smiles? Elizabeth tried to remember the last time she had felt the genuine emotion captured in those early photos. When had the sparkle in her eyes transformed into a dull reflection, carefully made up to hide the truth? The sound of the phone cut through the silence, making Elizabeth jump. It was Richard. "Hello, darling." His voice sounded distant, almost disinterested. "Just calling to let you know I'll be spending the night at the office. We have an important project to finish, and I can't let the team down." Elizabeth felt something break inside her. "Of course, love. Don't worry about me. Good luck with the project." She hung up the phone, her hands trembling slightly. Richard's words echoed in her mind, mixing with the looks and whispers of her friends at lunch. A wave of nausea washed over her, and she stumbled to the nearest sofa. For the first time in years, Elizabeth allowed herself to question the perfection of her life. The doubts she had kept buried for so long began to sprout, like weeds in an impeccable garden. What was happening to her marriage? Why was Richard becoming increasingly distant? And what did her friends know that she didn't? As the sun set, casting long shadows across the silent mansion, Elizabeth remained seated, motionless. The carefully constructed facade of her perfect life was beginning to crumble, revealing the cracks and imperfections she had tried so hard to hide. That night, lying alone in her king-size bed, Elizabeth stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The realization that her life wasn't as perfect as it seemed consumed her. The tears she had repressed for so long finally found their way, staining the silk pillows. Dawn found her still awake, her red and swollen eyes contrasting with the perfection of her room. Elizabeth knew something needed to change. But what she didn't know was that her life was about to be turned upside down in ways she could never have imagined. I finished writing the first chapter of our telenovela, titled Mirrors of Illusion. In this chapter, I introduced Elizabeth, our protagonist, and began to establish the setting of her seemingly perfect life, with subtle signs that not everything is as it appears. The day dawned grey in Boston, as if the sky reflected the turmoil of emotions stirring in Elizabeth's heart. She rose from bed, her eyes still swollen from a sleepless night, and faced her reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back seemed like a stranger, vulnerable, insecure, so different from the immaculate image she had always projected. With a deep sigh, Elizabeth decided she could no longer ignore the doubts gnawing at her. She needed answers, and the first step would be to confront her friends. With renewed determination, she dressed meticulously, as if her impeccable appearance could serve as armor against the truth she feared to discover. At the country club, the air was heavy with expectation. Elizabeth arrived earlier than usual, discreetly observing the other women arriving for their tennis matches or spa sessions. Her attentive eyes caught furtive glances and muffled whispers, increasing her certainty that something was wrong. Sarah was the first to arrive for lunch, her face a mask of forced sympathy. "Elizabeth, darling, what a surprise to see you so early. Is everything all right?" Elizabeth forced a smile. "Of course, Sarah. I just thought it would be nice to enjoy the morning here at the club. You seem tense. Is there something you want to tell me?" Sarah's smile faltered for an instant. "Me? Tense? Imagine that. It must be the day-to-day stress. You know how it is, don't you?" Before Elizabeth could press further, Emily and Rachel arrived, creating a welcome distraction for Sarah. The four women sat down, ordering their usual drinks and chatting about trivialities. But Elizabeth could feel the tension in the air, as dense as the fog that sometimes covered the city. "Girls," Elizabeth began, her calm voice masking the inner turmoil. "I can't shake the feeling that you're hiding something from me. We've been friends for years. Please, if there's something I should know, tell me." A heavy silence fell over the table. The three friends exchanged nervous glances, each waiting for another to take the initiative. Finally, it was Rachel who spoke, her voice low and hesitant. "Elizabeth, we didn't want to be the bearers of bad news, but you deserve to know the truth." Elizabeth's heart raced. "What truth?" Emily intervened, her words coming out hurriedly. "It's about Richard. Well, there are rumors circulating at the club. People have seen him with another woman." "Several times." Elizabeth's world seemed to slow down. Her friends' voices became distant as if she were submerged in water. Fragments of memories flashed through her mind. Richard's frequent absences, his excuses about working late, the emotional distance. "Who is she?" Elizabeth heard her own voice ask, as if coming from far away. Sarah took a deep breath before answering. "Megan Thompson, the new tennis instructor at the club." The name fell like a bomb. Elizabeth knew Megan, a young, vivacious woman full of energy, everything that she, Elizabeth, was no longer, or at least everything she thought she was no longer. For how long? Elizabeth could barely formulate the question. "We're not sure," Rachel replied gently. "But the rumors started a few months ago." Elizabeth felt as if the ground had been ripped out from under her feet. Months. While she had been living her perfectly choreographed life, her husband had been building a new life with another woman. The pain of betrayal was almost physical, a tightness in her chest that threatened to suffocate her. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked, struggling to maintain her composure. The three friends exchanged guilty looks. It was Emily who answered. "We wanted to be sure before saying anything, and to be honest, we were afraid of how you would react. You always seemed so controlled, as if nothing could shake your perfect world." Emily's words hit Elizabeth like a slap. Was that how people saw her? A cold, untouchable statue living in a bubble of perfection. The realization was as painful as the discovery of Richard's betrayal. "I need a moment," Elizabeth muttered, abruptly rising from the table. Ignoring her friend's concerned calls, she walked quickly to the club's gardens, seeking an isolated spot where she could process everything she had discovered. She found a bench hidden behind a well-trimmed hedge. She sat down, her legs trembling, and finally allowed the tears to fall. Years of repressed emotions emerged in an uncontrollable torrent. Elizabeth cried for Richard's betrayal, for the life she thought she had, and for the woman she had become. An empty shell, living a life that wasn't really hers. As the tears dried, a new emotion began to take shape within her. Anger. Anger at Richard for his betrayal, anger at her friends for hiding the truth, and above all, anger at herself for having allowed herself to live a lie for so long. With trembling hands, Elizabeth took out her cell phone. She hesitated for a moment before dialing Richard's number. It went straight to voicemail. "Richard," she said, her voice surprisingly firm, "we need to talk. I'll be home tonight. Don't you dare invent another excuse about working late." She hung up, feeling a mixture of fear and determination. She knew that the conversation she would have with Richard would change her life forever. But for the first time in years, Elizabeth felt she was taking the reins of her own destiny. She returned to the table where her friends were anxiously waiting. Their faces showed a mixture of concern and relief to see her return. "Thank you for telling me the truth," Elizabeth said, her voice calm but laden with emotion. "I know it must not have been easy." Sarah reached out, holding Elizabeth's hand. "We're here for you, darling. Whatever you need." Elizabeth nodded, grateful for the support even if belated. "I'm going to confront Richard tonight. I don't know what will happen, but I know I can't continue living this lie." Her friends offered words of encouragement and support, but Elizabeth barely heard them. Her mind was already on the conversation she would have with Richard, the questions she needed to ask, the answers she feared to hear. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Elizabeth wandered through the mansion, each object, each photograph now seeming a painful reminder of a life that was crumbling. When she heard the sound of Richard's car entering the garage, her heart raced. Richard entered, looking tired and distracted as always. But something in his expression changed when he saw Elizabeth waiting for him in the living room, a fierce determination in her eyes. "Elizabeth? What's going on?" he asked, a touch of nervousness in his voice. Elizabeth took a deep breath, gathering all her courage. "Sit down, Richard. We have a lot to talk about." The sound of the door closing behind Richard echoed through the house, marking the end of an era and the beginning of an uncertain future. Elizabeth knew that the next few hours would change the course of her life forever. But for the first time in a long time, she was ready to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The silence in the living room of the Anderson mansion was palpable. Elizabeth and Richard sat facing each other, the air between them charged with tension and unspoken expectations. Elizabeth's eyes, normally warm, now shone with a mixture of determination and hurt. Richard, in turn, seemed restless, his fingers drumming nervously on the arm of the Italian leather armchair. "So," Elizabeth began, her voice surprisingly firm. "How long, Richard?" Richard frowned, feigning confusion. "What are you talking about, Elizabeth? How long what?" "Don't play dumb with me," Elizabeth retorted, anger finally spilling over in her voice. "How long have you been cheating on me with Megan Thompson?" The name fell like a bomb in the room. Richard visibly paled, his eyes widening in shock. For a moment it seemed he would try to deny it, but something in Elizabeth's expression made him back down. How did you find out?" he stammered, the mask of confident and successful man crumbling before Elizabeth's eyes. "Does it matter?" Elizabeth replied, disappointment evident in her voice. "What matters is that it's true. All these months, years maybe? While I believed we had a perfect life, you were building another one behind my back." Richard ran his hand through his graying hair, a gesture of frustration that Elizabeth knew well. "Elizabeth, I didn't plan this. It happened. Megan is young, vibrant, everything I'm not anymore," Elizabeth completed, bitterness tinging her words. "It's not that simple," Richard protested weakly. "We grew apart, Elizabeth. You with your world of social events and charity, me with my business. Megan, she made me feel alive again." Richard's words were like stabs to Elizabeth's heart. Each justification, each excuse, was a painful reminder of how they had lost each other over the years. "And you didn't think we could have talked about this? Tried to reconnect?" Elizabeth asked, tears now flowing freely down her face. 20 years of marriage, Richard, thrown away for an affair with a tennis instructor. Richard had the decency to look ashamed. "I know I messed up, Elizabeth, but we can't pretend our marriage was fine before this. We were two strangers living in the same house, playing roles in a play that lost its meaning long ago." Elizabeth wanted to scream, wanted to throw things, wanted to make Richard feel a fraction of the pain she was feeling. But years of social conditioning prevented her. Instead, she took a deep breath, trying to regain control. "What do you want, Richard?" she finally asked. "Do you want a divorce? Do you want to leave everything behind and start a new life with Megan?" The question hung in the air for long moments. Richard seemed to be waging an internal battle, his eyes moving restlessly around the room, avoiding Elizabeth's penetrating gaze. I don't know," he finally admitted. "Part of me wants that, yes. To start over, without the weight of expectations, of appearances. But another part..." "Another part what, Richard?" Elizabeth pressed. "Are you afraid of losing your status, your social position? Or maybe you're worried about what your partners will think when they find out you traded your wife for a younger woman?" Elizabeth's words hit Richard like a slap. He abruptly stood up, walking to the window. The view of the nighttime city, normally a spectacle of lights and life, seemed cold and distant. "That's not fair, Elizabeth," he muttered. "You know it's not just that." "Not fair?" Elizabeth repeated, incredulous. "You know what's not fair, Richard. Spending years believing we have a solid marriage, only to discover that it's all just a facade. It's not fair to be betrayed not only by my husband, but by someone who frequents the same social circles as I do. It's not fair to be the subject of pity and gossip among people I considered friends." Richard turned to face her, his eyes reflecting a mixture of guilt and frustration. "You think I planned this? That I woke up one day and decided to ruin our life? It happened, Elizabeth. And yes, I know I was wrong in not being honest with you before, but we can't continue living a lie." Silence fell over them again, heavy and oppressive. Elizabeth slowly stood up, walking until she was face to face with Richard. For the first time in years, she really observed him, the lines around his eyes, the worry crease between his eyebrows, the grey at his temples. This man, whom she thought she knew so well, now seemed like a stranger. "You're right about one thing, Richard," she finally said. "We can't continue living a lie. But I also can't simply pretend that the last 20 years meant nothing. I need time. Time to think, to process all of this." Richard nodded slowly. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to leave," Elizabeth responded, her voice firm. "Go to a hotel, stay with a friend, it doesn't matter. But I can't share this house with you now, not when every corner reminds me of the life I thought we had." For a moment, Richard seemed to want to protest, but something in Elizabeth's posture, in the determination in her eyes, made him back down. "All right," he agreed. "I'll pack some things and leave tonight." Elizabeth watched in silence as Richard went upstairs to the bedroom. She heard the muffled sounds of drawers being opened, zippers closing. Each noise was like a hammer blow to her heart, marking the end of an era. When Richard came down, suitcase in hand, he found Elizabeth still in the living room. Their gazes met, 2 decades of history passing silently between them. "I'm sorry, Elizabeth," Richard said softly. "For everything." Elizabeth just nodded, unable to find words. She watched as he walked to the door, hesitating for a moment before turning the handle. "Goodbye, Richard," she murmured, more to herself than to him. The door closed with a soft click, and Elizabeth found herself alone in the huge mansion. The silence was deafening. Slowly she walked to the bar, pouring herself a generous shot of whiskey, an indulgence she rarely allowed herself. With glass in hand, Elizabeth wandered through the house, each room now seeming too big, too empty. She stopped in front of the wall of photographs, the frozen smiles in time mocking her current pain. On an impulse, she removed a photo, her and Richard on their honeymoon in Paris. She observed the image for a long moment, silent tears running down her face. Then, with a decisive movement, she placed the photo face down in a drawer. It was the end of a chapter in her life. Elizabeth knew that. But as she sat on the couch, watching the city lights through the window, she felt something unexpected grow inside her. It wasn't just pain or anger, but a spark of possibility. For the first time in years, the future was a blank canvas. Scary, yes, but also liberating. Elizabeth took a sip of her whiskey, the amber liquid burning her throat, an almost welcome sensation amid the whirlwind of emotions. "And now?" she asked the silence of the house. "What comes next?" The answer, she knew, wouldn't come easily. But for the first time in a long time, Elizabeth was ready to find out. The path ahead would be difficult, full of uncertainties and challenges. But it was her path to tread, her choices to make. With that thought, Elizabeth stood up, walking to the bedroom that was now hers alone. Tomorrow would be a new day, the first day of the rest of her life, and she was determined to face it with her head held high, no longer as Richard Anderson's trophy wife, but as Elizabeth, a woman rediscovering her own strength and identity. The sun had barely risen when Elizabeth opened her eyes. For a brief moment, the reality of the previous night's events had not yet hit her. Then, like a wave, the memories flooded her mind. The conversation with her friends at the club, the confrontation with Richard, the loneliness of the empty house. She sat up in bed, observing the side that used to be occupied by Richard. The emptiness there was a painful reminder of how her life had changed in a matter of hours. Elizabeth took a deep breath, trying to calm the whirlwind of emotions that threatened to consume her. "One day at a time," she murmured to herself, the words sounding strange in the silence of the room. She rose with determination, decided not to let herself be paralyzed by pain. The first step was to face the day, no matter how difficult it seemed. Elizabeth headed to the closet, her sanctuary of designer clothes and expensive accessories. But today, looking at the rows of elegant dresses and high heels, she felt a sense of estrangement. After a few minutes of contemplation, she opted for something she rarely wore: jeans, a simple shirt, and comfortable flats. She looked at herself in the mirror, surprised by the image reflected back. She seemed younger, more herself. She descended the stairs, the house echoing with her solitary steps. In the kitchen, she dismissed the maid's offer to prepare her usual breakfast. "Don't worry, Mrs. Anderson," said Maria, the housekeeper, who had worked for them for years. "You need to eat." Elizabeth smiled weakly. "Thank you, Maria, but I'll make my own coffee today." The surprise on Maria's face was evident, but she nodded respectfully and withdrew. Elizabeth found herself alone in the kitchen, a space she rarely frequented. With hesitant movements, she began to prepare a cup of coffee, something she hadn't done in years. As the water boiled, Elizabeth looked out the kitchen window, observing the impeccable garden. How many times had she admired that garden without really seeing it? How many details of her own life had she let pass, lost in routine and appearances? The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the kitchen, bringing an unexpected sense of comfort. Elizabeth brought the cup to her lips, savoring the strong and slightly bitter taste. It was different from the coffee served in fine porcelain cups by efficient staff, but somehow it seemed more real, more gratifying. With the cup in hand, Elizabeth walked to the office. It was time to face some practical realities. She sat at the desk, turned on the computer, and began reviewing her bank accounts and investments. To her surprise, she discovered she knew less about her finances than she imagined. Richard had always taken care of that part, leaving her free to manage social life and appearances. "This needs to change," she said aloud, determined to take the reins of her financial life. As she navigated through statements and documents, the phone rang. It was Sarah. "Elizabeth, darling," her friend's voice sounded worried. "How are you? We're so concerned." Elizabeth hesitated for a moment before answering. "I'm surviving, Sarah. It was a difficult night." "I can imagine," Sarah responded softly. "Look, the girls and I were thinking, how about we have lunch together today? Just the four of us in a quiet place. You don't need to be alone at this time." The offer was tempting. For a moment, Elizabeth considered refusing to dive into solitude and lick her wounds in private. But something inside her, a voice that had long been silenced, encouraged her to accept. "You know what? I think it will do me good," Elizabeth replied, surprising herself with the decision. They arranged to meet at a small bistro in the North End, away from curious eyes at the club and the social circles they frequented. Elizabeth hung up the phone, feeling a mixture of anxiety and relief. Facing her friends after the revelations of the previous day wouldn't be easy, but perhaps it was necessary. Before leaving, Elizabeth stopped once again in front of the mirror in the entrance hall. The woman staring back at her seemed different, not just because of the more casual outfit, but there was something in her eyes, a mixture of vulnerability and determination she hadn't seen in a long time. The journey to the bistro was a surreal experience. Instead of being driven by the chauffeur in the luxury car, Elizabeth opted to drive her own car, a more modest model she rarely used. The streets of Boston, always chaotic, seemed different viewed from the driver's seat. It was as if she were rediscovering her own city. She arrived at the bistro a few minutes early and chose a discreet table at the back of the establishment. The place was cozy, with exposed brick walls and plants hanging from the ceiling, so different from the chic restaurants she used to frequent. Sarah, Emily, and Rachel arrived together, their faces a mixture of concern and curiosity. Upon seeing Elizabeth, there was a moment of hesitation, as if they didn't know exactly how to act. "Elizabeth," Emily was the first to speak, her voice laden with emotion. "How are you?" Elizabeth took a deep breath before answering. "Honestly, I don't know. Everything seems so surreal." The four women sat down, an uncomfortable silence hovering over the table. It was Rachel who finally broke the ice. We really are sorry, Elizabeth, for everything. For not telling you sooner, for..." Elizabeth raised her hand, gently interrupting her. "No, please, you're not to blame. Actually, I should thank you. Without you, I'd still be living a lie." The waitress approached to take their orders, providing a brief pause in the tense conversation. When she walked away, Sarah leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Elizabeth. "What happened when you confronted Richard?" Elizabeth told her friends about the previous night's conversation, Richard's confession, his departure from the house. As she spoke, she felt as if she were reliving each moment, but at the same time as if she were telling someone else's story. "And now?" asked Emily, her voice soft. "What do you plan to do?" Elizabeth looked out the bistro window, observing the people passing on the street, each immersed in their own life, their own stories. "Honestly, I don't know," she replied, turning her gaze back to her friends. "For the first time in decades, I don't have a plan. I don't know what comes next, and that's scary and liberating at the same time." Rachel reached out, holding Elizabeth's hand. "You're not alone in this, dear. We're here for you, for whatever you need." Elizabeth felt tears forming in her eyes, but this time they weren't just of sadness. There was gratitude there, and a spark of hope. "Thank you," she whispered, squeezing Rachel's hand. "Really, thank you." The lunch continued, the conversation flowing more freely as the initial tension dissipated. For the first time in years, Elizabeth found herself speaking openly about her fears, her doubts, her long-forgotten dreams. It was as if a dam had broken, releasing years of repressed emotions. When they finally said goodbye, hours later, Elizabeth felt exhausted but in a strangely comforting way, as if she had run an emotional marathon and finally reached the finish line. Back in the car, she hesitated before starting the engine. The idea of returning to the empty mansion was oppressive. On an impulse, she decided to take a drive around the city. With no defined destination, Elizabeth found herself driving through neighborhoods she rarely frequented, observing a Boston that seemed entirely new to her eyes. She stopped at a park, deciding to walk for a bit. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees, creating patterns of light and shadow on the ground. Elizabeth observed families having picnics, couples walking hand in hand, children running and laughing, everyday scenes that somehow seemed extraordinary. She sat on a bench, closing her eyes and breathing deeply. The fresh air, the sound of leaves in the wind, the distant voices, everything seemed more vivid, more real than ever before. "One day at a time," she repeated to herself, this time with more conviction. When she finally returned home, it was already night. The mansion, once a symbol of her status and success, now seemed too big, too empty. But for the first time since the truth about Richard came to light, Elizabeth didn't feel overwhelmed by this vastness. Instead, she looked around with new eyes. This house, this life, were hers to redefine. The future, once so carefully planned and now so uncertain, was in her hands. Elizabeth slowly climbed the stairs, each step marking the end of a day of discoveries and the beginning of an unknown journey. As she prepared for bed, she looked at herself once more in the mirror. The woman staring back was still hurt, still confused, but there was something more there. A spark of determination, a glimpse of possibilities. "Tomorrow," she said to her reflection, "will be a new day." And for the first time in a long time, Elizabeth was truly curious to discover what that new day would bring. The weeks following Elizabeth and Richard's separation were a whirlwind of emotions and discoveries. The mansion, once a symbol of status and perfection, now seemed like a mausoleum of memories and shattered dreams. Elizabeth found herself wandering through empty rooms, touching objects that had previously gone unnoticed, each telling a silent story of a life that no longer existed. It was on one of these melancholic afternoons that Elizabeth made an impulsive decision. She picked up the phone and called Jessica, a real estate agent she had met at one of the numerous charity events she used to attend. "Jessica, it's Elizabeth Anderson. I need your help to sell the mansion." On the other end of the line, there was a moment of surprised silence before Jessica responded, "Elizabeth, what a surprise. Are you sure about this? It's quite a decision." Elizabeth took a deep breath, feeling a mixture of fear and excitement. "I am, Jessica. It's time for a change." In the days that followed, Elizabeth found herself immersed in a whirlwind of activities. Between visits from potential buyers and discussions about valuations and offers, she began to feel something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose, of being in control of her own life. Parallel to selling the house, Elizabeth decided it was time to do something she had long postponed, going back to school. Years ago, before marrying Richard, she had dreamed of becoming an architect. Now, at 40, the idea of returning to university seemed both terrifying and exciting. On a sunny afternoon, Elizabeth found herself sitting in the admissions office of Harvard University, as nervous as a teenager about to have her first interview. "Mrs. Anderson," said the educational counselor, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, "it's unusual but not impossible to receive older students in our undergraduate programs. May I ask what motivates you to seek such a significant change at this point in your life?" Elizabeth hesitated for a moment, carefully choosing her words. "I think, for a long time, I lived the life others expected of me. Now I want to live the life I always dreamed for myself." The counselor smiled, nodding with understanding. Well, we have a rigorous selection process, but we also value life experience. I suggest you start by preparing for the entrance exam. We have preparatory courses that can help you get up to speed." Leaving the university, Elizabeth felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The path ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in years, she felt truly alive. Meanwhile, the news of her separation and the sale of the mansion spread through Boston's social circles like wildfire. Elizabeth quickly discovered who her true friends were and who was just interested in gossip and drama. One afternoon, while having coffee with Sarah at a small cafe, a habit she was beginning to appreciate much more than extravagant lunches at the club, her friend surprised her with an unexpected question. "Elizabeth, have you ever thought about going to therapy?" Elizabeth almost choked on her cappuccino. "Therapy? Me? Why?" Sarah smiled gently. "Darling, you're going through enormous changes. Sometimes having someone neutral to talk to can make all the difference." Initially reluctant, Elizabeth eventually gave in to Sarah's suggestion. In her first session with Dr. Laura, a therapist recommended by her friend, Elizabeth was surprised by how much she had to say. "Elizabeth," said Dr. Laura after listening attentively, "it seems you're rediscovering who you are, without the expectations and labels you've carried for so long. It's a challenging process, but incredibly liberating." The therapy sessions became a safe harbor for Elizabeth, a space where she could be truly honest with herself and explore feelings she had repressed for years. It was during one of these sessions that Elizabeth finally verbalized something she had been feeling for weeks. I think I'm happy. Even with all the pain and uncertainty, I feel more alive than I have in years." Dr. Laura smiled. "That's wonderful, Elizabeth, and completely normal. Sometimes we need to deconstruct who we thought we were to discover who we really are." While her personal life was undergoing a revolution, the world around her continued to spin. Richard, she learned through mutual friends, had officially moved into Megan's apartment. The news, which weeks ago would have been devastating, now provoked only a slight twinge of sadness. One afternoon, while organizing some documents for the house sale, Elizabeth found a dusty box at the back of a closet. Inside, she discovered dozens of architectural sketches and drawings she had made years ago, before abandoning her dreams for the life of a trophy wife. With tears in her eyes, she spent hours re-examining each drawing, each idea she had left behind. It was at this moment that she had an epiphany. It wasn't too late to start over. With renewed determination, Elizabeth intensified her studies for the entrance exam. Her nights, once filled with empty social events, were now dedicated to books on mathematics, physics, and art history. It was difficult, sometimes frustrating, but each small victory, a problem solved, a concept understood, made her feel stronger, more capable. Amidst all this transformation, Elizabeth received an unexpected call. It was Julia, an old school colleague who had become a renowned architect. "Elizabeth, I heard you're thinking about studying architecture. How wonderful. Listen, I'm giving a lecture next week on sustainable architecture. Would you like to come?" The old Elizabeth would have hesitated, worried about appearances or what people would say. But the new Elizabeth, she accepted the invitation without thinking twice. The lecture was a revelation. Elizabeth found herself fascinated not only by the content, but by the passion with which Julia spoke about her work. After the event, the two talked for hours, reminiscing about old times and discussing new trends in architecture. "You know, Elizabeth," Julia said as they were saying goodbye, "if you really decide to follow this path, I'd love to have you as an intern in my office. It's never too late to pursue your dreams." That night, back in the mansion that would soon no longer be hers, Elizabeth sat on the veranda, observing the city lights. She thought about everything that had happened in the last few months, the betrayal, the pain, but also the discoveries, the new friendships, the resurrected dreams. Her phone vibrated with a message. It was from Richard. "We need to talk about the division of assets. Can we meet tomorrow?" Elizabeth looked at the message for a long moment. Months ago, a request like this would have triggered a storm of emotions. Now she was surprised by the calm she felt. "Sure," she simply replied. How about the cafe near your office at 10 a.m.? Putting the phone aside, Elizabeth went back to contemplating the city. Tomorrow would be another step in her journey, another chapter in her new life. There was still much to resolve, much to face. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, Elizabeth felt prepared for the challenges. With a sigh of contentment, she stood up and walked back inside the house. As she passed through the hallway, her gaze fell on a framed photograph, her and Richard on their wedding day. Bright smiles and eyes full of hope. For a moment, Elizabeth paused, observing the image. Then, with a soft smile, she removed the photo from the wall and put it in a box. Not with anger or bitterness, but with acceptance. That chapter of her life had ended, but a new one full of possibilities was just beginning. Lying in her bed that night, Elizabeth reflected on all the changes she had experienced and all those yet to come. The future was uncertain, yes, but for the first time in years that uncertainty excited her more than it scared her. New horizons, she murmured to herself, feeling sleep approaching. And with that comforting thought, Elizabeth fell asleep, eager for what the new day would bring. The cafe was busy that Wednesday morning. Elizabeth arrived a few minutes before the agreed time, choosing a discreet table in the corner. She ordered an espresso, something she rarely did in the old days, now preferring the strong, unadorned flavor. When Richard entered, Elizabeth observed him for a moment before he noticed her. He looked thinner with visible dark circles under his eyes. For a brief instant, Elizabeth felt a pang of concern, but quickly pushed the feeling away. It was no longer her responsibility to care for Richard's well-being. "Elizabeth," he greeted, sitting down. His voice betrayed a mixture of nervousness and fatigue. "Richard," she responded, keeping her tone neutral. "How are you?" He shrugged, a gesture so unlike the confident man she had known. "Surviving. And you? I heard you're selling the house." Elizabeth nodded. "Yes, it's time to move on. Actually, Richard, I'm making a lot of changes in my life." For a moment, a shadow of curiosity passed over Richard's face, but he quickly composed himself. "Well, it's about changes that we need to talk. I brought the documents for the division of assets." As Richard opened his briefcase, removing a series of papers, Elizabeth found herself reflecting on how things had changed. Months ago, the idea of dividing the life they had built together would have been devastating. Now it seemed just a necessary step towards the future. "Before we start," Elizabeth interrupted, surprising herself and Richard, "I want you to know that I don't hold a grudge. What happened, happened. I'm moving on, and I hope you're finding your way too." Richard stared at her, clearly caught off guard by the statement. For a moment, his businessman mask fell, revealing vulnerability. "Elizabeth, thank you. I don't even know what to say." They spent the next hour discussing the division of assets, bank accounts, and investments. It was a surprisingly civilized process, punctuated by moments of nostalgia when mentioning specific items from the life they had shared. At the end of the meeting, with the documents signed and agreements made, Richard hesitated before standing up. "Elizabeth, can I ask you something? What did you mean by a lot of changes in your life?" Elizabeth smiled, feeling a wave of enthusiasm when thinking about her new plans. "I'm going back to school, Richard. I'm going to take the entrance exam for architecture." The surprise on Richard's face was genuine. "Architecture? But wow, Elizabeth, that's unexpected and incredible." "Thank you," she replied, feeling strangely grateful for the support, even if belated. "It's scary, but I'm excited." They said goodbye with an awkward handshake, a gesture that symbolized the end of an era and the beginning of new chapters for both. Leaving the cafe, Elizabeth felt as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The conversation with Richard, although difficult, had brought a sense of closure that she didn't know she needed. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The sale of the mansion was almost complete, and Elizabeth found herself immersed in the task of deciding what to keep, what to donate, and what to leave behind. Each object seemed to carry a memory, some sweet, others now tinged with melancholy. It was during this process that Elizabeth rediscovered an old shoebox full of photographs. Sitting on the closet floor, she spent hours going through the images, laughing and sometimes crying at the memories they evoked. One photo in particular caught her attention, herself at 18, smiling broadly in front of a model of a building she had designed for a science fair. The eyes of young Elizabeth sparkled with passion and ambition. "Where did I lose myself?" she murmured to herself. That night, unable to sleep, Elizabeth went out for a walk. The streets of the upscale neighborhood were quiet, with only the occasional dog bark or distant sound of a car breaking the silence. Her steps led her to a small park where, years ago, she and Richard used to stroll in the early days of their relationship. Sitting on a bench, Elizabeth allowed herself to dive into memories. It was there, lost in thought, that she had an unexpected encounter. Elizabeth Anderson." She looked up, surprised to see a familiar face. Michael Thompson. My God, it's been so long." Michael, an old friend from college days, smiled warmly. "Years. What are you doing here so late?" "Just thinking," she responded honestly. "And you?" "Walking, Max," he said, indicating the Labrador by his side. "We just moved to the neighborhood. I'm opening an architecture studio nearby." The mention of architecture immediately caught Elizabeth's attention. "Really? What a coincidence. I'm thinking about going back to study architecture." Michael's eyes lit up. "No kidding. You were always talented in that area. I remember your drawings in art class." They spent the next hour talking, reminiscing about old times and discussing Elizabeth's future plans. Michael, excited about the idea of Elizabeth pursuing her dream, offered to be her mentor. "Look, if you want, you can stop by the studio any day. I can show you some projects, give you some tips for the entrance exam." Elizabeth gratefully accepted the offer, feeling that the universe was conspiring in her favor. In the days that followed, Elizabeth found herself divided between finalizing the sale of the mansion, studying for the entrance exam, and visiting Michael's studio. Each visit to the studio reignited her passion for architecture, and she found herself dreaming of the buildings she would one day design. It was during one of these visits that Elizabeth met Alex, one of the junior architects in Michael's studio. Alex, with his 35 years and contagious enthusiasm for the profession, quickly became a friend and informal mentor to Elizabeth. "You know, Elizabeth," Alex commented one day while reviewing some basic design concepts, "it's inspiring to see someone your age pursuing a dream like this. Many people simply settle." Elizabeth smiled, feeling a mixture of pride and nervousness. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm not being crazy, starting all over at 40. Alex shook his head emphatically. "Crazy? No, brave. And architecture needs people like you, with life experience and a unique perspective." Alex's words stayed with Elizabeth, giving her strength in the moments of doubt that inevitably arose. Meanwhile, the date of the entrance exam was rapidly approaching. Elizabeth intensified her studies, often staying up late revisiting concepts of mathematics and physics she hadn't seen in decades. One night, exhausted after hours of studying, Elizabeth received an unexpected message. It was from Megan, Richard's ex-lover, now partner. "Elizabeth, I know this may seem strange, but I'd like to talk to you. Can we meet?" Elizabeth stared at the message for long minutes, a whirlwind of emotions passing through her. Part of her wanted to ignore it, to bury the past once and for all. But another part, the part that was learning to face challenges head-on, knew that this meeting could be important for her healing process. After much pondering, she replied, "Okay, tomorrow 3 p.m. at the Boston Public Garden." Lying in bed that night, Elizabeth reflected on how her life had changed in the last few months. From the trophy wife resigned to her life of appearances, she had transformed into a woman determined to rebuild her life on her own terms. The meeting with Megan, the imminent sale of the mansion, the approaching entrance exam, all these events marked crossroads in her journey, decisions to be made, challenges to be faced. But for the first time in a long time, Elizabeth didn't fear the future. She awaited it with expectation, eager to see where this new path would lead her. With that comforting thought, she fell asleep, dreaming of tall buildings touching the sky and new horizons opening before her. The Boston Public Garden was teeming with life that sunny Thursday afternoon. Families were having picnics, young people were riding bicycles, and the elderly were walking leisurely along the shaded paths. Elizabeth arrived a few minutes before the agreed time, choosing a bench overlooking the lake. Her heart was racing, a mixture of anxiety and curiosity taking over her. What could Megan want? Was she coming in peace, or to create more conflict? At 3 p.m. sharp, Elizabeth saw Megan approaching. The young tennis instructor looked nervous, her restless eyes scanning the park until they found Elizabeth. For a moment, the two women stared at each other, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. "Hello, Elizabeth," Megan greeted, her voice trembling. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me." Elizabeth nodded, indicating the empty space beside her on the bench. "Hello, Megan. Why did you want to see me?" Megan sat down, her restless hands playing with the strap of her bag. I wanted to apologize. I know nothing I say can undo what happened, but I'm sorry. Really sorry." Elizabeth remained silent for a moment, letting Megan's words hang in the air. Part of her wanted to scream, wanted to blame this woman for destroying her marriage. But another part, the part that had grown and matured in recent months, knew that the situation was more complex than that. "Megan," Elizabeth began, her voice surprisingly calm, "what happened between you and Richard, it wasn't just your fault. Our marriage had been in crisis for a long time. Maybe you were just the catalyst for something that was already destined to happen." Megan's eyes filled with tears. "I never wanted to hurt anyone. Things just happened." "And now?" Elizabeth asked, noticing the hesitation in the other woman's voice. Megan took a deep breath before continuing. "Richard and we're not together anymore. We broke up a few weeks ago." The revelation caught Elizabeth by surprise. For a moment she didn't know how to react. Part of her felt a strange satisfaction, a sense of cosmic justice. But predominantly what she felt was compassion. "I'm sorry to hear that," Elizabeth said sincerely. "It must be difficult for you." Megan nodded, wiping away a tear. "It is. But I think it was inevitable. After everything that happened, there was a lot of guilt, a lot of tension between us. And Richard, he never really got over you, Elizabeth." Megan's words hit Elizabeth like a punch to the stomach. All those years of marriage, all the shared memories. It was hard to believe that everything had ended like this. "Megan," Elizabeth said after a moment of reflection, "thank you for coming to tell me this in person. It couldn't have been easy." The two women sat in silence for a few minutes, watching people passing through the park, each lost in their own thoughts. "And you, Elizabeth?" Megan finally asked. "I heard you're making big changes in your life." Elizabeth couldn't help but smile. "It's true, I'm selling the mansion, preparing for the architecture entrance exam. It's scary, but it's also exciting." Megan smiled back, a genuine smile free of tension for the first time since she had arrived. "That's amazing, Elizabeth. You always seemed so confident, so in control. It's inspiring to see you following your dreams like this." Megan's words touched Elizabeth in an unexpected way. It was strange to receive compliments from the woman who, months ago, she had considered her rival. But there they were, two women who had gone through transformative experiences, finding common ground. "You know, Megan," Elizabeth said, surprising herself, "I think we've both learned a lot from this whole situation, and I forgive you." Megan's eyes widened in surprise. "Elizabeth, thank you. That means a lot to me." The two women said goodbye with a hesitant but sincere hug. As she watched Megan walk away, Elizabeth felt as if a final weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Forgiveness, she realized, was as liberating for the one who offered it as for the one who received it. The days following the meeting with Megan were a whirlwind of activities for Elizabeth. The sale of the mansion was finally completed, and she found herself immersed in the process of moving to a smaller but cozy apartment in the Back Bay neighborhood. Between moving boxes and intensive study sessions, Elizabeth barely had time to breathe. But in every free moment, she found herself drawing, scribbling ideas for architectural projects on any piece of paper she could find. One afternoon, while organizing her books on the new bookshelf, Elizabeth received a call from Alex, the junior architect from Michael's studio. "Elizabeth, I have a proposal for you," Alex's excited voice sounded from the other end of the line. "We have a pro bono project to renovate a community center in Roxbury. I thought you could help us, you know. It would be a great practical experience before the entrance exam." Elizabeth felt her heart race with excitement. "Really?" Alex, that would be incredible. But are you sure? I mean, I still don't have experience. Relax, Alex reassured her. That's why it's perfect. You can learn in practice and we'll have a fresh perspective on the project. What do you say? I say yes, Elizabeth responded without hesitation. In the weeks that followed, Elizabeth found herself dividing her time between studying for the entrance exam and working on the community center project. It was exhausting, but incredibly rewarding. During a visit to the construction site, Elizabeth had an unexpected encounter. While discussing some details of the project with Alex, she noticed a group of children playing on the center's makeshift playground. One girl in particular caught her attention. About 8 years old, with curly hair and a contagious smile, the girl seemed to be leading the other children in a lively game. That's Lily, Alex commented, noticing Elizabeth's interest. She practically lives here at the center. Her mom works all day, so Lily spends her afternoons here. Elizabeth approached the group, fascinated by the children's energy and creativity. Lily, noticing her presence, came running towards her. Hi, miss. Are you the architect who's going to make our center beautiful? The girl asked, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. Elizabeth smiled, charmed by the girl's enthusiasm. Yes, I am, Lily. Actually, I'm learning to be an architect. What do you think the center needs? Lily's eyes lit up. A place for us to draw and read books, and maybe a garden on the roof. Lily's excitement was contagious. Elizabeth spent the afternoon talking with the children, listening to their ideas and dreams for the space. When she finally said goodbye, her mind was buzzing with new possibilities for the project. That night, back in her new apartment, Elizabeth found herself thinking about Lily and the other children at the center. How would their lives be impacted by a well-planned and welcoming space? How could architecture make a difference in these people's lives? Sitting at her improvised drafting table, Elizabeth began to draw furiously. Ideas flowed from her mind to the paper, a project taking shape before her eyes. She barely noticed the hours passing, so absorbed was she in her work. When she finally put down her pencil, it was already dawn. Elizabeth looked at the drawings scattered in front of her, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and exultation. There, in those sketches and outlines, was the future she had always dreamed of, but which for so long had seemed out of reach. Lying in bed, unable to sleep due to the excitement, Elizabeth reflected on her journey to this point. From the pain of betrayal to the rebirth of her dreams, each step had been necessary to bring her to this moment. The entrance exam was rapidly approaching, and with it the promise of a new chapter in her life. But regardless of the outcome, Elizabeth knew she had already achieved something precious, the courage to follow her dreams, to reinvent herself, to embrace the unknown. With a smile on her lips, Elizabeth finally fell asleep, dreaming of buildings that touched the sky and the bright smile of a little girl named Lily, whose dreams now intertwined with her own. The sun had barely risen when Elizabeth opened her eyes on that Saturday morning. It was the day of the entrance exam, the moment that would define the next chapter of her life. As she prepared, a mixture of nervousness and excitement bubbled in her stomach. Her new apartment, still with some boxes to unpack, was already beginning to gain her personality. On the living room wall, a framed sketch of the community center project occupied a prominent place. It was a constant reminder of the path she had chosen to tread. Before leaving, Elizabeth paused for a moment in front of the mirror. The woman staring back at her was very different from the one who, months ago, had lived a life of appearances in a mansion in Beacon Hill. Her eyes shone with determination, and there was a confidence in her posture that went beyond the surface. "You can do this," she murmured to her reflection, grabbing her bag and heading out to face the challenge that awaited her. The university campus was bustling, filled with anxious candidates and their families. Elizabeth momentarily felt out of place among so many young faces, but soon spotted other older candidates, some even older than her. This reassured her a little. While waiting in line to enter the exam room, Elizabeth felt her phone vibrate. It was a message from Sarah. "Good luck, darling. We're all rooting for you." Soon after, another message arrived, this time from Alex. "You're going to crush it, Elizabeth. Remember, you're already an architect at heart." The words of support brought tears to Elizabeth's eyes. She took a deep breath, feeling strengthened by the affection of her friends. The hours that followed were intense. Elizabeth immersed herself in the exam questions, her mind focused and alert. Years of reading, her passion for art and architecture, and months of intensive study were finally bearing fruit. When the bell rang, marking the end of the exam, Elizabeth let out a sigh of relief and satisfaction. Leaving the campus, exhausted but fulfilled, Elizabeth decided to take a walk to clear her mind. Her steps led her, almost unconsciously, to the Boston Public Garden. She sat on a bench, the same one where she had talked with Megan weeks ago, and allowed herself to absorb the beauty of the place. It was there, lost in thought, that a familiar voice surprised her. "Elizabeth?" She turned, surprised to see Richard standing there, with a hesitant expression on his face. "Richard, what are you doing here?" He shrugged, a gesture that reminded Elizabeth of the man she had met decades ago, before success and appearances had changed him. I heard today was the day of your entrance exam. I thought you might come here afterward. Old habits, I suppose." Elizabeth nodded, remembering how they used to stroll in the park in the early years of their relationship. "It was quite a day," she commented. Richard sat down beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. "How was it?" "Challenging, but I think I did well." A comfortable silence settled between them. It was strange, Elizabeth thought, how two people who had shared so much could now sit side by side like almost strangers. "Elizabeth," Richard began, his voice laden with emotion, "I wanted to tell you, I'm proud of you, of what you're doing, of how you're rebuilding your life." Richard's words caught her by surprise. "Thank you, Richard. That means a lot to me. I made a lot of mistakes," he continued. "I hurt you, betrayed your trust. But seeing you now, following your dreams, maybe in some strange way, all of this was necessary to free us. For you to be who you were always meant to be." Elizabeth felt tears forming in her eyes. "Maybe you're right. You know, for a long time I felt trapped, Richard. Not just by our marriage, but by who I thought I should be. Now I feel free." Richard smiled, a genuine smile that Elizabeth hadn't seen in years. "You deserve that freedom, Elizabeth. You deserve to be happy." They talked for a while longer, reminiscing about moments from the past, but also talking about their new paths. When they finally said goodbye, it was with a friendly hug and the feeling that a chapter had truly been closed. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind for Elizabeth. While anxiously awaiting the exam results, she dedicated herself fully to the community center project. Her ideas, inspired by conversations with Lily and the other children, were received with enthusiasm by the team. One afternoon, while working in Michael's studio, Elizabeth received an unexpected call. It was from the university. With her heart racing, she answered. "Hello? Mrs. Elizabeth Anderson?" a formal voice asked on the other end of the line. "We are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted into the Architecture and Urban Planning program." The world seemed to stop for a moment. Elizabeth could hardly believe what she was hearing. Tears of joy ran down her face as she thanked and hung up the phone. Alex, who was nearby, noticed her emotion. "Elizabeth, is everything okay?" She turned to him, a radiant smile on her face. "I passed, Alex. I passed the entrance exam." The entire studio erupted in celebrations. Michael opened a bottle of champagne he kept for special occasions, and everyone toasted to Elizabeth's success. Amid the celebration, Elizabeth found herself thinking about how her life had changed. From the pain of betrayal to the joy of this achievement, each moment had been part of a journey of self-discovery and rebirth. Days later, Elizabeth made sure to visit the community center to share the news with Lily and the other children. Their excitement was contagious. "Miss Elizabeth is going to be the best architect in the world," Lily exclaimed, hugging her tightly. Looking at those children, at the space that would soon be transformed by her ideas, Elizabeth felt a wave of purpose and fulfillment. She wasn't just building a new career, she was building a better future for people who really needed it. That night, back in her apartment, Elizabeth found herself reflecting on everything that had happened in the last few months. From the woman who lived in her husband's shadow, trapped in a life of appearances, she had transformed into someone who pursued her own dreams, who made a difference in others' lives. Sitting at her drafting table, Elizabeth began to draw. It wasn't a specific project, but a vision, her vision for the future. Buildings that not only occupied space, but created communities. Spaces that inspired, that welcomed, that transformed lives. As the pencil glided across the paper, Elizabeth felt a peace she hadn't experienced in years. She was exactly where she should be, doing exactly what she should be doing. The sound of her cell phone snapped her out of her reverie. It was a message from Sarah. "Celebration dinner tomorrow night." "I won't take no for an answer." Elizabeth smiled, feeling grateful to have friends who supported her on her journey. She replied, confirming her presence, and turned her attention back to the drawings. The hours passed without her noticing, and soon the sun was beginning to rise, painting the Boston sky with shades of pink and orange. Elizabeth stood up, stretching, and walked to the window. The city was slowly awakening, and with it, the possibilities of a new day. Elizabeth took a deep breath, feeling at peace with her past and excited about her future. There, watching the sunrise over the city she loved so much, Elizabeth knew she had found her true place in the world. Not as someone's wife, not as an ornament at elegant parties, but as Elizabeth, architect, dreamer, strong and independent woman. The path ahead would be challenging, she knew that. There would be nights of intense study, difficult projects, obstacles to overcome. But for the first time in a long time, Elizabeth was truly excited about what the future held. With a smile on her lips, she stepped away from the window and returned to her drafting table. There was much work to be done, many dreams to be built, and Elizabeth could hardly wait to begin. As the sun rose on the horizon, bathing Boston in its golden light, Elizabeth immersed herself in her drawings, her heart full of hope and determination. This wasn't an end, she realized. It was just the beginning of a new and exciting journey, and she was more than ready to embrace it.